One secret ingredient turned deadly. Who added it? Welcome to Wolfe's Casebook. I'm your host, Mr. Enigma. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Share it below. Your comments make this all worthwhile. Let's uncover the truth. If you want to get Nero Wolfe's attention, there are exactly 3 ways. 1. Threaten the orchids. 2. Threaten the brownstone. 3. Threaten Fritz's kitchen. Since no sane person would dare attempt the first 2, it was inevitable that the third would be the opening move in the case of the secret ingredient murder. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, warm enough that the city had shed its overcoats, but not its bad temper. I was at my desk trying to look busy when in reality I was rereading the sports section, and Wolfe was in his chair, digesting lunch with the solemnity of a federal judge. Fritz had made squab with morel sauce, and I'll tell you now, when Wolfe spends 3 minutes afterward with his eyes closed and lips moving like he's reciting poetry, it means Fritz outdid himself. So naturally, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and in walked a woman whose presence suggested trouble dressed up for the opera. She was mid-30s, maybe a little older, with the kind of polish you don't get from beauty salons, but from being rich enough never to sweat. Her gloves were pearl grey, her hat was tipped just so, and her eyes said she hadn't slept in 2 nights. She introduced herself as Mrs. Camilla Vaughan. "I must speak to Mr. Wolfe," she said, voice steady but with an undercurrent sharp enough to cut. "It concerns Fritz Brenner." That got Wolfe's eyes open. If you want him interested, invoke his chef's name. The man could ignore murder, treason, or the mayor himself, but the kitchen was sacred. I guided her to the red leather chair, took her gloves, and made sure she had a glass of water. Wolfe was already watching her with that expression that made visitors feel like they were being sorted into categories: useful, useless, or both. Mrs. Vaughan didn't waste time. "Mr. Wolfe, I was present at a dinner party 2 nights ago. It was hosted by Charles Meriden, the food critic. Perhaps you've heard of him?" "I have," Wolfe rumbled. "An irritant, a gadfly who mistakes provocation for discernment." Her mouth twitched. "Be that as it may, he is, or rather he was, alive when the evening began. By dessert he was dead. That was enough to make me sit up." Wolfe didn't move, but the atmosphere thickened like roux. She continued, "It was poison. That much the police have already established. But here is why I'm here. The dish that killed him was credited to Fritz Brenner. Now you don't have to know Wolfe well to guess his reaction." He rose. Not much, only an inch, but in Wolfe's world that's the equivalent of a Broadway chorus line kicking in unison. "Madam," he said, his voice low, "explain yourself." Mrs. Vaughan raised her chin. "Meriden boasted that he had procured a recipe from Fritz, a special ingredient, something unique. He announced it to the table as though he'd captured a crown jewel. The dish was served. He took 3 bites, and within minutes he collapsed. Bah, Wolfe snapped. Impossible. Fritz has never, would never. He stopped as if the words themselves were too unsavory. Then he looked at me. "Archie, already on it," I said. "But let's hear the rest first." Mrs. Vaughan leaned forward. "The police are already whispering that Fritz himself may be implicated. They claim Meriden could have stolen a recipe or coerced it, but either way, suspicion has fallen on him. And, Mr. Wolfe, if your chef is disgraced, you are disgraced." She knew her angle. Wolfe's scowl deepened, but he didn't bark her out of the room. That meant she'd succeeded. "What precisely?" Wolfe asked. "Do you wish me to do?" "To uncover the truth," she said simply. "Because I do not believe Fritz Brenner is capable of murder. But someone has arranged this to appear so." I studied her. She wasn't playing dramatics. The steel in her tone was real. She had a personal stake here. Whether loyalty to Fritz, loathing of Meriden, or fear of scandal, I didn't yet know. But I knew she had walked into the one house in New York where accusing Fritz of homicide would get immediate traction. Wolfe leaned back slowly, folding his hands over his vast middle. "I must consider." "Consider quickly," she said. "The police intend to arrest him tomorrow." The silence stretched. Fritz himself appeared at the door just then, tray in hand, oblivious to the storm brewing. He paused at seeing her, then looked to Wolfe. "Am I intruding?" "No," Wolfe said, his voice more deliberate than usual. "Come in. You are the subject." Fritz set the tray down gently, but his eyes flicked from Wolfe to Mrs. Vaughan and back. "The subject?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "Of a murder inquiry." The way Fritz's face tightened would have convinced a jury of 12 that the accusation was absurd. "That is impossible." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Which is why it offends me. Archie," he jabbed a finger in my direction. "We will take this case. Fritz must be exonerated." Mrs. Vaughan let out a breath she'd been holding. Fritz looked stunned, then grateful, though I could see the storm beneath his calm. Wolfe closed his eyes again. But I knew what was happening. The shutters had come down, the gears were turning, and the brownstone had just been conscripted into war. I didn't need orchids or beer to know what came next. Wolfe had declared it. The sanctity of the kitchen was under siege. And if Wolfe has a religion, it begins and ends with food. That was how the case entered the brownstone, not with gunshots or shadows in alleyways, but with a poisoned critic, a stolen recipe, and a threat to Fritz Brenner's good name. And if you think Nero Wolfe would let that pass unanswered, you don't know him at all. The moment Wolfe announced that Fritz must be exonerated, the air in the office shifted. Fritz himself stood with his hands clasped at his sides, his composure fighting to hold steady. He looked less like a chef accused of murder, and more like a man whose kitchen had been defiled. If you've ever seen Fritz in a temper, you know it's quiet, but it lingers in the way he folds his napkin or chops an onion. Now that temper flickered at the edges of his calm, like a flame refusing to die. Wolfe gestured to him. "Fritz, sit." Fritz obeyed, lowering himself into the red leather chair opposite Wolfe's desk, though the stiffness in his back suggested he'd rather be back in the kitchen whipping meringues. Mrs. Vaughan kept her eyes on him, steady and sympathetic, while I positioned myself near the globe where I could catch every expression. "First," Wolfe said, "tell me, have you ever communicated with Charles Meriden? By letter, phone, or otherwise?" "Never," Fritz replied, his accent thickening under strain. "He was not welcome here. He asked once. He sent a note requesting a luncheon prepared in his honor. So I burned it." "Good," Wolfe muttered. "Second, this secret ingredient, what could he mean?" Fritz's face reddened. "He speaks nonsense. I guard my recipes. I share nothing outside this house. If Meriden claimed he had from me a secret, he lied. Or he stole." Mrs. Vaughan leaned forward. "That was his boast, that Fritz had given him something no other chef possessed. He made a spectacle of it. He said he would reveal the true genius behind Brenner's cuisine." "Pfui," Wolfe said, his lips curling. "Meriden was a parasite. He could not create, so he appropriated Archie. Yes, sir. I will investigate the dinner party. Guests, sequence of courses, the precise dish that carried the poison. I will not venture, but you will. Bring me facts. Until then, Fritz remains in this house. If the police come, they will not have him without proof." Fritz inclined his head, though I could see the distress in his eyes. For Wolfe to even say, "if the police come," was admission enough that danger pressed close. Mrs. Vaughan rose. "I will help however I can. You should know, Meriden's death has already divided those who attended. There were 6 guests. Some admired him, some despised him, all feared him. Each of them could have reason to see him silenced." "Names," Wolfe demanded. She recited them carefully, as though each syllable could tip the balance of suspicion. "Dr. Lionel Stroud, a physician who fancied himself a gourmand. Evelyn Harper, the novelist, whose latest book Meriden mocked viciously. Gregory Ashford, a financier with a taste for rare wines. Meriden threatened to expose his dealings. Clara Kent, a restaurateur hoping for a favorable review to save her business, and myself." "And your reason?" Wolfe asked, his eyes opening just a fraction wider. Her chin lifted. Because Meriden threatened to publish something about my husband. Lies, I'm sure, but dangerous all the same. I did not kill him, Mr. Wolfe, but I will not pretend I am sorry he is gone. There it was. Every guest had motive. Wolfe closed his eyes again, filing them neatly into his private index. Archie, tomorrow morning you will begin. I nodded. Though it wasn't tomorrow morning I had in mind, it was tonight. If there's one thing you learn working for Wolfe, it's that sometimes speed beats perfection. While he brooded upstairs among his orchids, I planned to take the first steps into the mess myself. When Mrs. Vaughan left, Fritz lingered. His voice was low, nearly breaking. Mr. Wolfe, you know me. You know I would never— Enough, Wolfe said firmly. I know, but knowledge must be made manifest. That is Archie's task. Go to your kitchen. Prepare dinner as usual. Nothing shall disturb its sanctity. That was Wolfe's version of comfort, and Fritz took it, though his eyes still carried the shadow of insult. Later that evening, while Wolfe was locked away with his orchids, I slipped out into the city. I had an address for Evelyn Harper. Mrs. Vaughan had provided it, and I figured a novelist who'd been skewered by— Meriden's pen might loosen her tongue with the right prompting. Her apartment was in Greenwich Village, the kind of place where every bookcase groaned under too many manuscripts. She opened the door herself, a thin woman with sharp features and sharper eyes. She recognized me from the moment I said Wolfe's name. You're his assistant, she said. He sent you to sniff out suspects, didn't he? Call me his legman, I said. And yes, I'm here to ask about Sunday night. She let me in, gesturing to a chair. Ask then. I have nothing to hide. I didn't sit. Meriden mocked your book. Called it an insipid melodrama fit only for parlor shelves. You threatened to throw wine in his face. Her mouth twisted into a bitter smile. I did more than threaten. I did it. And I regret nothing. But you didn't poison him. Poison? She laughed harshly. No, he was already poisoning everything he touched. I wouldn't dirty my hands, she said it with conviction. But conviction doesn't clear suspects. She gave me details, though. The dish in question was a ragout served with a flourish, Meriden making a speech about Fritz's so-called secret ingredient. He ate it eagerly, basked in his own daring, then collapsed before coffee was poured. And the others? I asked. Stroud tried to revive him. Ashford called for silence, terrified of scandal. Clara Kent screamed. It was her restaurant providing the setting. And Mrs. Vaughan, well, she was as calm as ice. Too calm, if you ask me. That was the thing about suspects. They all had a mirror ready to point at someone else. I left Harper's place with more questions than answers. Stroud might have slipped poison into a dish under cover of medical fussing. Ashford had money to protect. Clara Kent's livelihood depended on a good review. And Vaughan, too calm, she'd said. Too practiced. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting in the office, his bulk sunk deep into his chair. Report, he said. I gave him the rundown, every word of Harper's account. He listened without opening his eyes, his lips pursed. Not useless, he said at last, but insufficient. You will see the others tomorrow. Stroud, Ashford, Kent. Gather contradictions, Archie. Truth hides in the fissures. And Mrs. Vaughan? He opened his eyes then, and they glinted. She interests me, but not yet. We will let her simmer. He closed them again, and the conversation was over. That was how it went. The first steps of a case that already stank of secrets. A poisoned critic, a stolen recipe, 5 suspects with sharpened knives in their pasts. And at the heart of it, Fritz Brenner's honor, which Wolfe would defend with the weight of his mind and the precision of his words. I didn't know yet who had laced Meriden's ragout with death. But I did know this. Wolfe had declared war. And when Wolfe declares war, no lie survives the campaign. Morning broke with a damp drizzle that painted the streets in silver streaks. The kind of weather that makes New York smell like wet paper and stale coffee. Fritz was in the kitchen banging pans harder than usual, which meant his patience was running as thin as strudel dough. Wolfe, naturally, was upstairs with the orchids, pretending the world outside his greenhouse didn't exist. That left me with a list of suspects and a job to do. First on the docket was Dr. Lionel Stroud, the physician who had been at the table when Meriden keeled over. Mrs. Vaughan had painted him as eager to play the savior, and I wanted to see just how much of that eagerness was real, and how much was performance. His office was in Midtown, a suite with frosted glass and the kind of furniture that said he billed more for a handshake than for a prescription. He was tall, thin, with a head of white hair that made him look distinguished, until you noticed his eyes darting like minnows. He greeted me with a handshake firm enough to impress patience, but not strong enough to convince me he wasn't rattled. "You're Mr. Goodwin," he said, ushering me into a leather chair. "Mr. Wolfe's man. I heard he'd taken an interest. Tell me, does he suspect me?" "Doctor," I said, crossing my legs, "if Wolfe suspects you, he hasn't told me. But I can tell you this. Being the guy who leapt to revive a poisoned critic doesn't exactly make you untouchable. Sometimes it makes you the perfect cover." That got him sweating. He wiped his brow with a folded handkerchief. "I assure you I had no part in it. Meriden was, well, he was odious, yes, but murder? That's absurd. My reputation, my practice, I wouldn't risk them for his death, yet you were there. And you know poison, don't you? Comes with the medical territory." He leaned forward, indignant. "Yes, I know poisons, which is why I can tell you what was used. Arsenic, without a doubt. The symptoms were unmistakable. Whoever administered it knew what they were doing, but they didn't count on my recognizing it so quickly. That was a nugget worth pocketing. I kept my face neutral. And how exactly would a ragout end up laced with arsenic in front of 6 people? He spread his hands. "That is the mystery. The dish was served directly from the kitchen. None of us handled it before Meriden began eating. If you ask me, someone in the restaurant staff must have—" "Nice try," I said, standing. "But the police aren't looking at line cooks. They're looking at you and the rest of the table." And so is Wolfe. That shook him. He tried to sputter a reply, but I left him to his nerves. Next stop was Gregory Ashford, financier and wine collector, who lived in a Fifth Avenue apartment large enough to make Rockefeller feel thrifty. His butler led me into a study lined with rare vintages, each bottle probably worth more than my salary for a year. Ashford himself was squat, heavy-set, with a face that had learned how to smile only when money was involved. "Goodwin," he said, lighting a cigar thick enough to choke a horse. "I suppose you're here to rake through the ashes of Sunday night." "Something like that," I said. "You were there. Meriden was poisoned. You had motive. Care to explain why Wolfe shouldn't pin this on you?" He chuckled, blowing a cloud of smoke. "Meriden was a parasite, but he was useful. He owed me money, and I had ways of keeping him in line. Killing him, that would be cutting off my own leverage. Hardly profitable. Unless," I said, "he threatened to publish something that would ruin you. Mrs. Vaughan suggested as much." That wiped the smirk off his face. "She talks too much." Meriden blustered. "Yes, but I had nothing to fear. My affairs are in order." I didn't press too hard, but the way his fingers tightened on the cigar told me "in order" was an exaggeration. He shifted the subject quickly, offering me a drink I didn't take, then insisting he had no idea how poison could have reached Meriden's plate. The performance was polished, but cracks showed. From there I moved to Clara Kent's restaurant. It was a modest establishment, tucked on the edge of Midtown, with a reputation built on charm rather than cash flow. She met me in her office, a small room cluttered with menus and unpaid bills. She was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s, the kind whose pride held her together even when the numbers didn't. "I know why you're here," she said, before I could sit. "You think I poisoned Meriden to keep him from writing a bad review." "Well," I said, "when a man keels over in your restaurant, it doesn't exactly help the press clippings." Her mouth tightened. "Do you think I wanted that? My God, the scandal has nearly sunk me already. No one wants to eat in a place where a man died at the table. If I were going to silence him, I'd have chosen another venue." "Or maybe," I said, "you thought killing him in your place would pin it on someone else. Someone like Fritz Brenner." Her eyes widened, and for a second I thought she might slap me. Instead she hissed, "I respect Fritz. I would never tarnish him. Meriden was arrogant enough to steal his name. That was his undoing, not mine." She was convincing, but I'd been around long enough to know conviction and innocence don't always travel together. By the time I made it back to the brownstone, dusk had settled. Wolfe was in the office with a bottle of beer, waiting. I gave him the rundown. Stroud with his medical knowledge and nervous hands, Ashford with his money games, Clara Kent with her pride and debts. When I finished, Wolfe folded his hands across his stomach. So each had motive. Each denies opportunity. Typical, and yet... He opened his eyes, heavy with certainty. One lies, and I shall uncover which. But before that, Archie, you will see Mrs. Vaughan again. She is too composed, too eager to defend Fritz, probe her further. I nodded, though I knew it wouldn't be easy. Vaughan had steel beneath her poise. But Wolfe was right. Sometimes calm is the best disguise of all. As I left him to his beer and orchids, I couldn't shake the thought. Meriden may have died with a mouthful of ragu, but what he really choked on was a nest of secrets. And Wolfe had just begun to stir them. I set out for Mrs. Vaughan's townhouse the following afternoon, the drizzle giving way to a slate-grey sky that matched the mood of the case. Wolfe had been adamant. Her composure was suspicious, and when Wolfe calls someone suspicious, you don't argue. You just show up and start pressing buttons until something lights up. Camilla Vaughan lived on the Upper East Side, in a place that screamed old money, though not loud enough to suggest she was still swimming in it. A maid with the face of a disapproving gargoyle let me in and announced me. Mrs. Vaughan appeared in the drawing room a moment later, dressed in a tailored navy suit that could have walked straight out of a society page. She offered me a seat, but didn't bother with tea. That was fine. I hadn't come for the china. "Mr. Goodwin," she said smoothly, "I expected you might return. Mr. Wolfe wants more, doesn't he?" "Always," I said, "especially when someone's too calm about being near a murder. Most people crack at the edges. You, on the other hand, look like you've been waiting for it." Her smile was tight. "I am not in the habit of losing control, Mr. Goodwin. It doesn't serve me." "That's admirable," I said, leaning back, "but it doesn't serve Wolfe. He likes people to sweat. So let's make it simple. Why did Meriden want you at that dinner?" She hesitated, just a flicker, but enough for me to note it. "He invited me. He wanted me to hear what he intended to announce about Fritz Brenner. He knew I admired Mr. Brenner's work, and he thought it would wound me. He was vindictive like that." I raised an eyebrow. "Admired or connected?" "You knew Fritz?" Her gaze hardened. "No, I respect his reputation. That is all." The denial came too quickly. Wolfe would have chewed on that like a tenderloin. I decided to try a different angle. "You mentioned before that Meriden had threatened to publish something about your husband. Care to elaborate?" Her expression flickered again, then smoothed. "He claimed my husband had invested in fraudulent ventures. Utterly false, of course. But a man like Meriden could make lies sound like gospel. My husband is away in Europe. He doesn't even know this scandal has happened, and I intend to keep it that way." It sounded rehearsed, not false necessarily, but polished like silver. "And polished answers don't grow in the wild. Mrs. Vaughan," I said, "let's be plain. You had motive. You had opportunity. You also had composure while the others panicked. That makes you prime material on Wolfe's list. If you're hiding something, it's better to spill it here than wait until Wolfe wrings it out of you in his office, because he will." She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. "You may tell Mr. Wolfe," she said at last, "that I did not poison Charles Meriden. Whatever satisfaction his death brings me, it was not by my hand. If he doubts me, then summon me to his judgment. I will endure it. There was steel there, and maybe desperation tucked under it. I let it rest, but the cracks were showing. I left her townhouse with more certainty that Wolfe's instincts had been right. Calm was her disguise, not her nature. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the whole story, every word and flicker of her expression. He listened, his eyes closed, while I paced. When I finished, he opened them just long enough to say, She dissembles. There is connection to Fritz she conceals. That is intolerable. Fritz, who'd been polishing glassware in the dining room, appeared at the door. "Mr. Wolfe, I swear to you I have never met that woman. If she claims otherwise, she does not claim it." Wolfe cut him off. "That is the point. She evades it." And evasion in this context is more pernicious than claim. Fritz's face flushed. Whether from anger or fear, I couldn't tell. Wolfe waved him away gently, though the dismissal stung. That evening the phone rang. It was Sol Panzer. His voice was calm, steady, but the words made me sit up. "I've been keeping tabs, Archie. Stroud met with Ashford this afternoon at a private club. No one else was present. Conversation looked heated. When they parted, Ashford looked like a man who'd lost a hand of cards he couldn't afford. I passed this to Wolfe. He exhaled through his nose, which is the Wolfe equivalent of a trumpet blast. Collusion, then, or panic? Either way, the pot boils." He leaned forward slightly, a rare sign of engagement. "Archie, tomorrow evening you will invite them all here. All of them. Stroud, Harper, Ashford, Kent, Vaughan. I will see them. This house has been disturbed. Now it must be purged." I knew what that meant, the famous office gathering. Wolfe's theatre of deduction, where suspects became audience and lies collapsed under the weight of his words. "Do I tell them why?" I asked. "Tell them only this," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing. "That if they wish to avoid disgrace, they must come. And bring candor, if they can still muster it." That was Wolfe, never subtle with the bait, but irresistible all the same. The next day was a marathon of phone calls and arrangements. Stroud tried to protest, but wilted under the mention of Wolfe's name. Harper agreed eagerly, clearly wanting to relive the drama. Ashford grumbled. But fear has a way of prying men out of their armchairs. Clara Kent came with a voice thick with dread, and Mrs. Vaughan, she accepted with the calmness of someone already resigned to standing trial. By 8 o'clock, the office was prepared. Wolfe's chair behind the desk, the red leather chairs arranged in their semicircle, Fritz stationed like a sentinel near the door. Wolfe sat with the immovability of a mountain, his bulk settled, eyes half shut, hands folded. I leaned on the globe, notebook ready. The unofficial bailiff to Wolfe's courtroom they filed in one by one. Stroud pale, Harper sharp-eyed, Ashford sweating under his expensive suit, Clara Kent trembling, Mrs. Vaughan serene to the point of unnatural. Each took their place. When the room was full, Wolfe opened his eyes. The silence was thick enough to slice. "You are here," he said, his voice heavy, "because you are implicated. Charles Meriden is dead, and you sit at the periphery of his demise. Each of you had reason to wish it. Each of you had opportunity, but only one of you executed it. Tonight, that fact will be made manifest." The storm outside rattled the windows as if to underline his words. The suspects sat stiff, each waiting for Wolfe to pronounce doom. And me, I knew the show was just beginning. Wolfe had them, and he wasn't about to let go until one of them broke. The storm outside seemed to lean against the windows as though it, too, wanted to hear Wolfe. He sat perfectly still, massive and immovable, while the 5 of them shifted in their chairs like schoolchildren waiting for a scolding. I had the globe at my back, notebook in hand, watching them and cataloguing every twitch, every cough, every subtle angle of their bodies. Wolfe didn't need my notes. He'd take what he needed by ear alone. But I like to keep records in case he missed something. Spoiler, he never does. "You came to Mr. Meriden's table," Wolfe began, his tone slow and resonant, each carrying malice. He prided himself on discovering secrets, but what he truly discovered was the limit of your tolerance for his cruelty. That night he pressed beyond it. "And he paid." Evelyn Harper leaned forward, eyes glittering. "Then you know one of us killed him." "Pfui," Wolfe rumbled. "I know more than that. One of you contrived to implicate Fritz Brenner by claiming that Meriden's fatal dish contained his secret ingredient. That lie offends me beyond measure. Fritz does not divulge, nor does he poison, so we must determine who profited by besmirching him." Stroud wiped his brow, the handkerchief fluttering like a flag of surrender. I tried to save him, Mr. Wolfe. I recognize the signs, arsenic beyond question. But how it entered the ragout I cannot fathom. You cannot? Wolfe asked, his lids lifting slightly. Yet you, a physician versed in toxins, were at the table. You knew the symptoms. You knew what would be found. Convenient, is it not, to speak with authority when authority shields you? Stroud stiffened. You suggest I suggest nothing yet. You will wait. Wolfe's voice cut through the protest like a cleaver through bone. Stroud sank back, lips pressed tight. Wolfe turned his gaze toward Gregory Ashford. You, sir, dabbled in commerce with Meriden. Money binds, but money also tempts. He owed you, yes? Ashford puffed up. Yes, but killing him would erase the debt. That would be sheer stupidity. Not if the debt was uncollectible, Wolfe said calmly, or if he held evidence of your impropriety, evidence you could not afford to see published. Ashford's hand twitched, nearly dropping his cigar. There were rumors only. Nothing substantiated. Rumors he intended to substantiate, Wolfe countered. You had cause. You also had the position at table nearest the dish. Ashford sputtered, but Wolfe had already shifted his attention to Clara Kent. She looked small in her chair. Her hands knotted together in her lap. Mrs. Kent, Wolfe said, his tone softening by a hair, your restaurant hosted the dinner. Your livelihood rested on Meriden's pen. One stroke could condemn or exalt you. Instead, he died on your premises. You say this ruined you, but was it not safer than a review that damned you utterly? Her voice cracked. No, you don't understand. People won't come where death has walked. I begged him for fairness, but murder. Murder would destroy me more than his words ever could. Her sincerity rang, but sincerity, Wolfe once told me, is the cheapest disguise. He moved on without affirmation, letting her stew. Finally, his eyes fixed on Camilla Vaughan. She sat serene, shoulders back, gaze unwavering. You, Wolfe said, intrigued me most of all. You claimed attachment, yet you came to me first. You carried the tale that accused Fritz. Why? To protect him, she said evenly. Because I knew the lie would spread. I wanted you to stop it. You conceal more than you reveal, Wolfe said. You knew Fritz, though you deny it. How? Her composure didn't flicker. I do not know him. Bah, your manner betrays you. You have dined on his food privately, perhaps at a society event where he lent his skill. You admired him, and when Meriden stole his name, it stung you. She didn't answer, but a faint tremor in her hand gave her away. Wolfe let the silence grow until it pressed on all of them. At last he spoke, his voice gathering weight. One of you placed arsenic in that dish. To do so required opportunity. The ragout was served from the kitchen, yes, but the bowls passed by many hands before Meriden's lips. The killer needed a moment, no more than that. And each of you had one. He leaned back, eyes closing, letting the words hang. No one dared break the quiet, not even Harper, who usually relished drama. After a long pause, Wolfe opened his eyes again. We are not finished. Archie, tomorrow you will retrace the serving of that dish from kitchen to table. Every hand, every glance, every pause. Only thus will the fissure widen. I nodded, though I knew it meant trudging through Clara Kent's restaurant again, questioning waiters who'd rather forget the whole ordeal. But Wolfe had set the course, and when he sets it, you sail or you drown. The suspects shifted uneasily, sensing dismissal, but too wary to move. Wolfe closed his eyes once more, the mountain resettling. That was their cue. They filed out, muttering, glancing over shoulders like children released from detention. When the door shut and the office was ours again, I exhaled. "You sure know how to make friends, boss?" "Phooey," Wolfe murmured. "Friends are irrelevant. Truth is imperative. Tomorrow we shall have it." And with that he reached for his beer, ending the session. The storm still rattled the windows, but inside the brownstone Wolfe had begun his siege. The next morning dawned brighter, but I wasn't fooled. Clear skies in New York are just bait before the next storm. Fritz was already in the kitchen, working pastry like it had personally offended him, and Wolfe was upstairs with the orchids, immune to weather and tempers alike. My assignment was straightforward enough. Retrace the fatal ragou's journey from stove to table and see who had the chance to lace it with arsenic. Wolfe had called it imperative, which in his language translates to, "If you don't find it, Archie, don't bother coming back with your shoes on." Clara Kent's restaurant looked even more beleaguered in daylight. The front windows bore the sheen of half-hearted polishing, and the maitre d' greeted me with the weary politeness of a man bracing for his 5th funeral call. He ushered me back to the kitchen where Clara herself waited, her apron crisp but her eyes shadowed. "You've come to dig again," she said without warmth. "Not dig," I told her. "Trace, Wolfe wants every step accounted for. Think of it as an autopsy, but for soup." "It wasn't soup," she snapped. "It was a ragout." That spark of pride, even in disgrace, gave her away as genuine. We went over it piece by piece. The ragout had been prepared in advance, simmering in a heavy-bottomed pot on the back burner. Her sous chef, a wiry fellow named Matteo, had tended it. When Meriden gave his pompous introduction, the pot was carried out to the service station. From there, 2 waiters ladled portions into bowls. The first bowl went to Meriden, as he demanded. The rest followed clockwise around the table. I had the waiters brought in one by one. The first, a young man with nervous hands, swore he had ladled directly from the pot into Meriden's bowl. "I didn't add anything," he said, eyes wide. There wasn't time. He was watching me, making a speech. Everyone's eyes were on him. That made sense. But Wolfe's maxim whispered in my head. "Attention on the loudest man leaves shadows for the quietest." The second waiter admitted to ladling the other bowls, but his hands trembled when I asked if he'd paused between them. "Just a second, sir." I wiped a spill on the rim of one bowl. He couldn't recall which. That second was enough for arsenic. A flick of the wrist, a pinch of powder, and the game was done. Matteo, the sous chef, was less cooperative. He folded his arms and glared. "You think I poisoned Meriden?" He insulted everyone, not just me. "I cooked the ragout, yes, but I never left the pot." Miss Kent was beside me. "She can say." Clara nodded stiffly. "He's right." I was there the whole time. Matteo touched nothing but the ladle. I believed her, though belief doesn't weigh much in Wolfe's scales. Still, the focus narrowed. The waiters, the service station, those brief seconds while Meriden blustered about his conquest of Fritz's supposed recipe. On my way out, Clara stopped me. "Mr. Goodwin," she said quietly, "do you think it was me?" "If I thought that," I told her, "I wouldn't be telling you." "Wolfe would." She gave me a brittle smile. "Then I'll pray he spares me." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my report with his eyes shut, the picture of repose. When I finished, he said, "So the ragout left the kitchen untainted. It was corrupted in passage, not in creation." "That's my read," I said. "But which waiter? And more importantly, on whose orders?" Wolfe's lips curved faintly. "Ah, Archie, that is the marrow. The waiters are pawns. Someone gave direction, or slipped the agent to them, and pawns leave traces of their masters." He rang for Fritz, who came in, wiping his hands. "Yes, sir?" "Arsenic," Wolfe said flatly. "Could Meriden have obtained it himself to stage drama?" Fritz shook his head violently. "He was many things, but not suicidal. He wished to wound others, not himself. Then it was placed by another. Archie, Saul must investigate the waiters. Their accounts, their debts, their connections. See who among our circle of suspects had access to them." I called Saul, who didn't ask questions, just grunted agreement. Meanwhile, Wolfe sat motionless, but I could see his mind carving paths. He thrived on this stage, suspects circling, tension thickening. Each lie a thread for him to tug until the whole weave unraveled. That evening, I paid a visit to Evelyn Harper. Novelists, I've noticed, can't resist revisiting a drama once they've played a role in it. She poured 2 glasses of sherry and lit a cigarette, her hands steady despite the tension humming in the air. "So," she said, "Wolfe is closing the circle, isn't he?" "He's tightening it," I corrected. "Closing comes later. Tell me, Did you notice anything unusual with the serving? The waiters, the dishes, anything? She exhaled smoke in a long-practiced stream. Yes, Meriden was crowing, as you know, but I saw Stroud's eyes. He was watching the bowls, not the man. Too intent. And when Meriden took the first bite, Stroud leaned forward as though expecting the collapse. It was subtle, but I noticed. That was something Wolfe would savor. Stroud, with his medical knowledge, his nervousness, his too-perfect diagnosis of arsenic, watching too closely as though waiting for proof. By the time I got back, Saul had left a message. One of the waiters had debts, gambling, small but dangerous. Guess who he'd been seen taking cash from in the past? Gregory Ashford, our financier with a cigar thicker than his scruples. Wolfe listened to both pieces of news with a grunt of satisfaction. So, Stroud knew too much too soon. Ashford had influence over a waiter. Vaughan dissembles about Fritz. Harper relishes the drama but gains nothing, and Kent is ruined regardless. Each motive is sufficient. But only one dared act. He steepled his fingers, closing his eyes again. We are near the marrow, Archie. Tomorrow they return. And tomorrow truth will bleed. The storm had passed outside, but in the brownstone the pressure only grew. Wolfe had set his stage. The pawns had moved. Now it was only a matter of time before the king declared checkmate. The following evening, the brownstone's office once again turned into Wolfe's private theatre. Fritz had polished the red leather chairs until they shone like guilty consciences, and Wolfe sat planted in his oversized throne behind the desk, immovable as Mount Rushmore. I stood near the globe, pen and pad in hand, though the pen was mostly for show. Wolfe never needed my notes. What he needed was my eyes, my ears, and the occasional nudge to break a suspect's rhythm. They arrived in staggered bursts, Stroud first, pale and fidgeting, as though he expected the walls to accuse him. Harper next, sharp and restless, cigarette case clutched like a weapon. Ashford followed, sweat already trickling under his collar despite the brisk night air. Clara Kent came in tight-lipped, shoulders slumped from the burden of her collapsing restaurant. Vaughan was last, serene as ever, her gloves impeccable, her poise intact. When the circle was complete, Wolfe opened his eyes. "You return because you must," he said, his voice low and steady. "The police are content to let suspicion rot. I am not. Charles Meriden was poisoned, and Fritz Brenner's name was misused to mask the deed. I will not allow that. Tonight we narrow the field." Stroud cleared his throat. "Mr. Wolfe, I've told you all I know." I tried to revive him. "Silence," Wolfe commanded, not raising his voice but slicing through Stroud's protest like a scalpel. "You will speak when addressed. Until then you will listen." That quieted him. Wolfe turned to Ashford. "You, sir, dabbled in commerce with Meriden. He owed you money and you held his leash. Yet Sol Panzer informs me that one of the waiters at that dinner, a man with pressing gambling debts, had previously accepted cash from you. Explain." Ashford blanched, cigar trembling between his fingers. I've helped men in need. Alone, nothing more. Pfui, you exploit weakness. That waiter indebted was vulnerable. You had means to reach him, to instruct him. Did you?" Ashford's jaw worked. "No, I swear it." "Your oath is worthless," Wolfe said coolly. "For you will sit." Ashford sat, sweat darkening his collar. Wolfe's gaze shifted to Stroud. "Doctor, you diagnosed arsenic with undue swiftness. Too swift unless you had foreknowledge." Stroud gripped his chair arms. "I recognize the symptoms, nausea, convulsions, classic. Any competent physician would hesitate to name the agent so quickly," Wolfe countered. "Unless he awaited confirmation of his own act." Stroud's face mottled. "That's outrageous. I had no reason to—" "No reason?" Wolfe's brows rose. "Meriden mocked you, undermined your credibility in journals, called you a charlatan. That is reason. And your knowledge of poisons gave you the method." The room tightened. Harper leaned forward, savoring the tension. Clara Kent's hands twisted in her lap. Vaughan remained still, her gaze fixed on Wolfe like a duel. Wolfe shifted slightly, his voice turning heavier. "And yet Your knowledge betrays you. Arsenic, yes, but the delivery. Not from the kitchen. Archie has traced the sequence. The ragout left the stove pure. It was tainted between pot and mouth. That is opportunity limited to two, the waiters who ladled. One of whom, beholden to Ashford, paused long enough to alter a bowl. Ashford sputtered, but Wolfe raised a hand, silencing him. Not yet. Harper. She startled as though caught mid-thought. Yes? You relished Merridin's death, Wolfe said flatly. You admit you flung wine at him? But you lack subtlety. Poison requires patience, and you desire spectacle. I do not believe you wielded the powder. But you saw. Tell us what you observed. Her eyes gleamed. Stroud was watching too closely, waiting. I told your man Goodwin as much. Stroud jerked, furious. Lies. Wolfe ignored him. Kent, he said, turning to Clara, your livelihood perished with Merridin's collapse. You claim it ruined you more than his pen ever could. Yet desperation breeds rashness. Did you arrange with your staff? No, she cried, voice breaking. I begged him for mercy, yes, but murder. That would end everything. I loved my restaurant. I would not poison it with blood. Her anguish seemed real, though Wolfe gave no sign of concession. His eyes, dark and heavy, turned finally to Camilla Vaughan. You, he said, his tone colder than ice. You came first, unbidden. You told me of Fritz's supposed ingredient. Why, unless you wished to steer suspicion, unless you needed to control the narrative before the truth controlled you. Vaughan's voice was calm, measured. I came because I feared Fritz would be accused. That has proven true. I sought his protection. But you sought to shield yourself. You dissembled about knowing Fritz, yet your admiration is too personal. You were wounded when Merridin mocked him. Why? Her mask didn't break, but her knuckles whitened against her gloves. Because I despise lies. That is all. Lies offend you? Wolfe asked. Then you offend yourself. You withhold the truth. The threads converge and you sit at their knot. But I will not yet cut it. Tomorrow you return again. By then I shall have clarity. You may leave. No one moved. Wolfe closed his eyes, signaling dismissal. Reluctantly, one by one, they filed out. Stroud fuming, Harper smirking, Ashford trembling, Kent hollow, Vaughan unbroken. When the door closed behind them, I let out a low whistle. You certainly know how to warm up a crowd, boss, but you didn't pin it on anyone. His eyes opened a slit. Not yet. The truth is there. Stroud's knowledge, Ashford's leverage, Vaughan's concealment. One binds the others. I must consider. He reached for his beer, his face set in stone. Archie, tomorrow before they return you will dig deeper into Mrs. Vaughan. She is the axis. Find what she hides. Without it, the pattern remains incomplete. I nodded, though I knew it meant combing through society records, old newspapers, maybe a few reluctant informants. Vaughan had steel, but steel rusts when scratched. As Wolfe drank, the office filled again with silence. The storm outside had passed, but inside the brownstone it was only gathering force. The following evening, the brownstone's office once again turned into Wolfe's private theatre. Fritz had polished the red leather chairs until they shone like guilty consciences, and Wolfe sat planted in his oversized throne behind the desk, immovable as Mount Rushmore. I stood near the globe, pen and pad in hand. Though the pen was mostly for show, Wolfe never needed my notes. What he needed was my eyes, my ears, and the occasional nudge to break a suspect's rhythm. They arrived in staggered bursts, Stroud first, pale and fidgeting, as though he expected the walls to accuse him. Harper next, sharp and restless, cigarette case clutched like a weapon. Ashford followed, sweat already trickling under his collar despite the brisk night air. Clara Kent came in tight-lipped, shoulders slumped from the burden of her collapsing restaurant. Vaughan was last, serene as ever, her gloves impeccable, her poise intact. When the circle was complete, Wolfe opened his eyes. "You return because you must," he said, his voice low and steady. "The police are content to let suspicion rot. I am not. Charles Merridin was poisoned, and Fritz Brenner's name was misused to mask the deed. I will not allow that. Tonight we narrow the field. Stroud cleared his throat. Mr. Wolfe, I've told you all I know. I tried to revive him. Silence, Wolfe commanded, not raising his voice but slicing through Stroud's protest like a scalpel. You will speak when addressed. Until then you will listen. That quieted him. Wolfe turned to Ashford. You, sir, dabbled in commerce with Meriden. He owed you money and you held his leash. Yet Sol Panzer informs me that one of the waiters at that dinner, a man with pressing gambling debts, had previously accepted cash from you. Explain. Ashford blanched, cigar trembling between his fingers. I've helped men in need. Alone, nothing more. Phew, you exploit weakness. That waiter indebted was vulnerable. You had means to reach him, to instruct him. Did you? Ashford's jaw worked. No, I swear it. Your oath is worthless, Wolfe said coolly. For you will sit. Ashford sat, sweat darkening his collar. Wolfe's gaze shifted to Stroud. Doctor, you diagnosed arsenic with undue swiftness. Too swift unless you had foreknowledge. Stroud gripped his chair arms. I recognize the symptoms, nausea, convulsions, classic. Any competent physician would hesitate to name the agent so quickly, Wolfe countered. Unless he awaited confirmation of his own act. Stroud's face mottled. That's outrageous. I had no reason to— No reason? Wolfe's brows rose. Meriden mocked you, undermined your credibility in journals, called you a charlatan. That is reason. And your knowledge of poisons gave you the method. The room tightened. Harper leaned forward, savoring the tension. Clara Kent's hands twisted in her lap. Vaughan remained still, her gaze fixed on Wolfe like a duel. Wolfe shifted slightly, his voice turning heavier. And yet, your knowledge betrays you. Arsenic, yes, but the delivery. Not from the kitchen. Archie has traced the sequence. The ragout left the stove pure. It was tainted between pot and mouth. That is opportunity limited to two, the waiters who ladled. One of whom, beholden to Ashford, paused long enough to alter a bowl. Ashford sputtered, but Wolfe raised a hand, silencing him. Not yet. Harper. She startled as though caught mid-thought. Yes? You relished Meriden's death, Wolfe said flatly. You admit you flung wine at him? But you lack subtlety. Poison requires patience, and you desire spectacle. I do not believe you wielded the powder. But you saw. Tell us what you observed. Her eyes gleamed. Stroud was watching too closely, waiting. I told your man Goodwin as much. Stroud jerked, furious. Lies. Wolfe ignored him. Kent, he said, turning to Clara, your livelihood perished with Meriden's collapse. You claim it ruined you more than his pen ever could. Yet desperation breeds rashness. Did you arrange with your staff? No, she cried, voice breaking. I begged him for mercy, yes, but murder. That would end everything. I loved my restaurant. I would not poison it with blood. Her anguish seemed real, though Wolfe gave no sign of concession. His eyes, dark and heavy, turned finally to Camilla Vaughan. You, he said, his tone colder than ice. You came first, unbidden. You told me of Fritz's supposed ingredient. Why, unless you wished to steer suspicion, unless you needed to control the narrative before the truth controlled you. Vaughan's voice was calm, measured. I came because I feared Fritz would be accused. That has proven true. I sought his protection. But you sought to shield yourself. You dissembled about knowing Fritz, yet your admiration is too personal. You were wounded when Meriden mocked him. Why? Her mask didn't break, but her knuckles whitened against her gloves. Because I despise lies. That is all. Lies offend you. Wolfe asked. Then you offend yourself. You withhold the truth. The threads converge and you sit at their knot. But I will not yet cut it. Tomorrow you return again. By then I shall have clarity. You may leave. No one moved. Wolfe closed his eyes, signaling dismissal. Reluctantly, one by one, they filed out. Stroud fuming, Harper smirking, Ashford trembling, Kent hollow, Vaughan unbroken. When the door closed behind them, I let out a low whistle. You certainly know how to warm up a crowd, boss, but you didn't pin it on anyone. His eyes opened a slit. Not yet. The truth is there. Stroud's knowledge, Ashford's leverage, Vaughan's concealment. One binds the others. I must consider. He reached for his beer, his face set in stone. Archie, tomorrow before they return, you will dig deeper into Mrs. Vaughan. She is the axis. Find what she hides. Without it, the pattern remains incomplete. I nodded, though I knew it meant combing through society records, old newspapers, maybe a few reluctant informants. Vaughan had steel, but steel rusts when scratched. As Wolfe drank, the office filled again with silence. The storm outside had passed, but inside the brownstone it was only gathering force. The following evening the brownstone's office was set again for battle. Fritz had polished the brass on the globe until it gleamed, though his eyes were still dark with worry. The red leather chairs formed their inevitable semicircle, waiting for suspects who by now understood that this room was less a study than a tribunal. Wolfe sat at his desk, immovable, the folds of his face heavy with calm. He hadn't spoken much all day, which meant he had spoken volumes inside his own head. They arrived as dusk fell. Stroud first, twitching like a patient overdue for a sedative. Harper next, hairpin tighter than before, cigarette unlit but fingers itching for it. Ashford came lumbering, red-faced, puffing with the indignation of a man used to controlling the room, but stripped of his stage. Clara Kent followed, shoulders hunched, grief still etched into her frame. Vaughan was last again, serene in a dark dress that could have been chosen for mourning or defiance. Once they were seated, Wolfe opened his eyes. "You return," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a verdict not yet spoken. "Because you must. Archie Goodwin has scoured your histories. I have assembled the facts. Tonight you will hear them." The silence tightened. Stroud swallowed audibly. Vaughan's chin lifted half an inch. Wolfe began without hurry, as though dictating to posterity. Meriden sought power not through creation, but through ruin. He threatened each of you. Dr. Stroud, he mocked your practice, threatening to publish articles branding you a fraud. Mrs. Harper, he derided your work and delighted in your humiliation. Mr. Ashford, he held your debts and dealings in his hand, poised to crush you. Mrs. Kent, he held the future of your restaurant with his pen. And Mrs. Vaughan, he carried a dossier on your husband's ventures, prepared to brand him a criminal. Each of you had motive, but one of you chose method. He leaned back slightly, hands folded over his belly. Arsenic, an agent known, accessible, and deadly, introduced not in the kitchen, but between kitchen and table. A waiter indebted to Mr. Ashford paused. That pause sufficed. And the powder was dropped. Ashford jolted upright. "That's a damned lie. I never—" "Sit," Wolfe commanded, and Ashford sagged back, lips quivering. "The waiter may have been your creature, yes, but he is not the architect. He is a pawn. The hand that gave him poison was not yours." He turned his eyes toward Stroud. "Doctor, your eagerness to declare arsenic was overreach. Too swift, too precise. You knew what had been used because you expected it. Yet your role was not to administer, but to anticipate, to lend false certainty. You were not the killer. You were the cover." Stroud's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing Wolfe had spared him only half a noose. "Mrs. Harper," Wolfe went on, "you relished Meriden's fall. You flung wine, you shouted, you reveled. But you lacked the patience of poison. You wanted spectacle, not stealth. You are absolved by your very temperament." Harper gave a short, bitter laugh, but it faltered when Wolfe's gaze slid past her. "Mrs. Kent," he said, "you hosted the dinner and it ruined you. But you spoke truth when you said murder would destroy you more than his words. I believe you. You lacked the coldness required." Her shoulders sagged, relief and despair mingling in one motion. Finally, Wolfe turned to Vaughan. The room seemed to constrict, every breath waiting. "Mrs. Vaughan," he said, his voice precise as a scalpel, "you lied to me. You denied knowing Fritz Brenner, yet records prove you engaged him to cater your anniversary. You dissembled because Meriden meant to use that connection. In his papers we found notes. Approach Vaughan for proof. Use her to tie Brenner to secret ingredient. He blackmailed you with your husband's ventures, and he sought to tarnish Fritz through you. You had double cause to silence him. Her face remained composed, but her gloved hands trembled on her lap. You alone, Wolfe continued, possessed both motive and access. You met with Meriden privately. You could pass arsenic to the waiter under guise of a favor, a folded note, a gratuity. He, beholden to Ashford, accepted without question. Thus the ragout bore death, and Meriden fell. The waiter unwittingly carried your deed. Vaughan's lips parted, but Wolfe pressed on. Your calm was too perfect, your silence too measured. You came to me first, to steer suspicion, to cloak yourself in the guise of Fritz's defender. In doing so, you betrayed your fear. That is why you dissembled, why you sought to manage the narrative. But narratives unravel, Mrs. Vaughan, and yours is done. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vaughan's eyes darted once, then steadied. If what you say is true, she murmured, then I have only spared others from ruin. Meriden was poison himself. Foy, Wolfe said with finality. You spared no one. You acted for yourself, not justice. The law will have its due. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Vaughan closed her eyes, her composure folding at last, though without tears. Stroud let out a strangled sound. Ashford exhaled like a man reprieved. Harper lit her cigarette with trembling fingers. Clara Kent buried her face in her hands. I crossed to the phone, dialing with the ease of habit. Wolfe had delivered the verdict, and the brownstone was once again the court of last resort. When the call was made and the suspects dismissed, Wolfe leaned back, heavy and still. Archie, he said, Meriden feasted on secrets. Tonight we feasted on his. I couldn't help a grin. Not the kind Fritz would serve, but satisfying all the same. Indeed. Wolfe closed his eyes, hands folded once more. Now dinner! I am famished. And that was the end of it. One critic silenced, one culprit exposed, one chef vindicated. The brownstone returned to order, and Wolfe returned to his peace. As inevitable as gravity, Inspector Kramer arrived not long after I made the call, stomping into the brownstone like a man determined to leave his boot prints on the carpet. He carried his usual storm cloud with him, cigar clenched between his teeth, eyes already narrowed at Wolfe as though daring him to waste time. Fritz met him at the door with a glare that could have curdled milk, but he stepped aside when I told him this was business, not burglary. They're saying you've got my killer gift-wrapped, Kramer growled as he barged into the office. And if this is another one of your tricks, Wolfe, I'll— Pwee! Wolfe interrupted, not even opening his eyes. Spare me the preamble. Mrs. Camilla Vaughan poisoned Charles Meriden. She did so by enlisting the unwitting service of a waiter indebted to Gregory Ashford. The evidence is there. Take her. Kramer puffed hard on his cigar, glaring at Vaughan, who sat rigid in her chair, hands folded like a woman awaiting sentence. You admit this? He barked. She lifted her chin. I admit nothing, but I will not deny it either. Meriden was a monster. He ruined lives. He meant to ruin mine. I stopped him. That'll sound real sweet to a jury, Kramer said, snapping his fingers at the men who'd followed him in. They closed around her, pulling her to her feet. She went quietly, not with resignation exactly, but with the dignity of someone who knew the game was over. When the door shut behind them, silence pooled back into the office. Wolfe reached for his beer, poured a measured glass, and sipped with a sigh as though the removal of Vaughan had also removed a thorn from his side. Fritz appeared then, hovering in the doorway like a man testing whether his sanctuary had been restored. Mr. Wolfe? Yes, Fritz, Wolfe said without looking up. It is finished? It is finished, Wolfe confirmed. Meriden's lies will not stain your name. Fritz drew in a long breath and stepped into the room, his shoulders loosening for the first time in days. His voice softened. I thank you. You thank Archie, Wolfe said gruffly. It was his legwork, his prying, that unearthed Vaughan's duplicity. Fritz gave me a solemn nod. I shrugged. All in a day's work. But if you want to show your gratitude, Fritz, I wouldn't say no to a strudel sometime soon. That earned me the faintest of smiles before he returned to his kitchen. Footsteps lighter than they had been in weeks. Kramer came back in briefly, tugging at his hat. You know, Wolf, one of these days you're gonna overstep. You sit here in your big chair pulling strings, and we just mop up. I don't like it. Wolf's eyes opened a fraction. Yet you depend on it. Kramer scowled, but he didn't argue. He stomped out, leaving behind the ghost of cigar smoke and irritation. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it. Well, that's that. Fritz is safe. Vaughn's in custody, and Merredin's dirt gets buried with him. Case closed. Wolfe set his glass down with precision. Not closed, Archie. Merredin is dead, yes, but his kind persist. Carrion feeders who thrive on the frailties of others. The world is fertile for them, I grinned. That's cheerful. He ignored me. What matters is that the sanctity of this house endures. Fritz may cook, I may think. You may gad about as you please, and the orchids bloom untouched. That balance must be preserved. It is fragile, and it is worth guarding. That was Wolfe's version of sentiment. You had to listen closely to catch it, buried under layers of disdain and formality. But I knew what he meant. Fritz had been cleared. The brownstone was whole again, and order had been restored inside Wolfe's personal kingdom. The rest of the evening passed as though nothing had happened. Dinner was served, pheasant with chestnut stuffing, because Fritz wasn't about to celebrate survival with anything less than artistry. Wolfe ate in silence, savoring each bite, his mind already retreating into the comfortable fortress of appetite. Later, as he settled into his chair with another beer, I finally spoke. You know, boss, sometimes I wonder what it's like for them. The ones who walk in here thinking they can lie to you. Vaughan, Stroud, Ashford, all of them. They sit down in those red chairs, and within an hour they're stripped bare. Wolfe's eyes closed, the faintest flicker of a smile on his lips. It is folly to lie in a house built on truth, Archie. Even greater folly to believe the lie can outlast silence. I let that settle, then leaned back with a grin. Well, for what it's worth, I think the house is sound. Merredin tried to bring rot into it, and Vaughan helped him. But you fumigated the place. Nothing left but the smell of Fritz's roast and a few bruised egos. Wolfe grunted, which I took for agreement. He raised his glass. To appetite, he murmured. I raised an imaginary glass of my own. Hand to stories worth telling. That was the end of it. A poisoned critic, a desperate woman, and a kitchen defended like a fortress. Wolfe had rendered his judgment, and the brownstone breathed easy again. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual chaos, but inside dinner was served. Orchids waited upstairs, and Nero Wolfe remained the immovable center of it all. For me, it was just another case. But for Wolfe, it was a reminder of his creed. Justice delivered not with guns or fists, but with words, logic, and an appetite sharpened by human folly. And that, if you ask me, is a recipe Merredin never could have stolen. The brownstone had returned to its familiar rhythm, though the air still carried the faint echo of the storm we'd just weathered. Fritz clanged away in the kitchen, this time with purpose instead of fury, and the scent drifting under the door told me he was making up for lost peace with a vengeance. Wolfe was back in his chair where he belonged, hands folded across his belly, the weight of the city's chaos outside sealed firmly on the other side of the door. You'd think nothing had ever disturbed the sanctity of his routine, but I knew better. I'd seen the tension in Fritz's eyes when he carried in the trays that evening, the tightness in his jaw that had only just begun to fade. I'd seen Wolfe lean forward more than once over the past week, roused not by orchids or gastronomy, but by the insult to his household. And I'd seen myself chasing down half-truths from people who thought they could hide behind polish, arrogance or desperation. No, the brownstone was whole again, but it had been rattled, and I doubted any of us would forget it soon. After dinner, Wolfe remained in the office with a fresh glass of beer. He had spoken little through the meal, a sign not of satisfaction but of thought. He gestured for me to sit, and I took the red chair opposite him. "Archie," he said at last, his voice low, "human appetite is not confined to the stomach. It extends to vanity, greed, fear, even the perverse delight in destruction." Charles Meriden embodied that truth. He fed on others until he choked on his own gluttony. "That's one way to put it," I said. Another would be he made a career out of ticking people off until one of them got creative with the pantry. He shot me a glance, not exactly sharp, but weighted. Triviality obscures clarity. Mrs. Vaughan believed she acted to preserve her husband's honor, her own standing. In truth, she surrendered to the same appetite she despised in Meriden. She consumed his life as he consumed hers. I leaned back, watching him. When Wolfe got like this, philosophical, deliberate, you could almost forget the girth and the grumbling. You saw the mind, precise and relentless, turning human folly into axioms. "Funny thing," I said. "She still looked like she thought she'd done something noble when Kramer walked her out. Like she was protecting Fritz, you, even me." "Phooey," Wolfe muttered. "She protected nothing. She betrayed. She lied to me, to herself, to Fritz. She diminished the very order she claimed to value. And for that I hold her in contempt." I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. Still, I'd watched Camilla Vaughan walk out of the brownstone with her head high, and I couldn't help but think she believed every word of her own self-justification. People usually do, even when the words are poison. "Kramer will get his conviction," I said. "The waiter will testify about the powder she passed him. Stroud will fold under questioning, and the papers will print it all under headlines about scandal in high society. Case closed." "Not closed," Wolfe corrected, eyes sliding shut again. "Concluded. Closure is a myth. Meriden's death will ripple. Ashford will scramble to secure his affairs. Harper will pen a novel with a villain thinly veiled. Kent's restaurant may never recover. And Fritz, though absolved, will remember the sting of suspicion. Nothing closes, Archie. It only evolves. That was Wolfe all over. Where most saw an ending, he saw a pattern stretching on. He'd never admit it, but that was why he sat immovable in this office. Because the world outside was too mutable, too untidy, and only here could he impose permanence. I got up to pour myself a drink, letting the silence stretch. "You know, boss, sometimes I think you enjoy these messes more than you admit. You sit there railing against intrusions, but the second someone drags in a scandal with sharp enough edges, you perk up like Fritz when the butcher delivers prime cuts." His eyes opened, dark and steady. "Enjoyment is irrelevant. Obligation is not. If I must endure the intrusion of folly, I will at least see it excised." "Fair enough," I said, settling back into my chair. "But for what it's worth, you did more than excise. You saved Fritz's good name. And believe me, that means more to him than all the strudel in the world." A faint grunt escaped him, and if you squinted hard enough, you might call it approval. The night wore on, the city outside humming its usual discordant tune. Inside, the office glowed with lamplight, and Wolfe's bulk filled the great chair like a statue that had outlasted empires. I finished my drink and stood. "Going out?" he asked, though he already knew. "Just for a walk," I said. After a week of poison and pretense, I could use fresh air. "You want anything?" "Peace," he said, closing his eyes again. "Bring me peace." "Sorry," I said with a grin. "Fresh air's easier to find." He didn't answer, which meant the conversation was over. I slipped out, leaving him with his beer and his silence. The brownstone was steady again, its order restored. But I knew as I stepped into the cool night air that the world outside would always find a way to intrude again. And when it did, Wolfe would be ready, grumbling, immovable, brilliant. And me? I'd be there too, notebook in hand, ready to chase the lies until he wrung the truth out of them. That's the way it goes in this house. The orchids bloom, the kitchen thrives, the great man thinks, and I run the streets. And if you ask me, it's not a bad way to keep the world in order. The days that followed had the peculiar stillness of a house that had just expelled an intruder. Fritz moved through the kitchen with his old rhythm restored, knives flashing, pans hissing, aromas rising in waves that erased the stench of suspicion. Upstairs, Wolfe resumed his 2 daily hours with the orchids, as if the world had not dared to disturb them. To anyone who walked in now, the brownstone looked untouched, unmarked. But I had lived through its siege, and I knew better. A house doesn't forget when poison has crossed its threshold. I kept busy tying up loose ends. Saul confirmed that the waiter had folded under quiet questioning, admitting that Mrs. Vaughan had slipped him an envelope the night of the dinner. He hadn't known it contained powder, but he'd followed her instructions, because a man in debt doesn't ask questions when he's being handed cash. Kramer took that and ran with it, his case sealed tight enough to please even the district attorney. Stroud retreated back into his practice, rattled but untouched. Harper seemed almost invigorated, already telling friends she had the bones of a new novel. Ashford scrambled to put out fires in his business dealings, whispering that Merridin's death had been a tragedy, while privately sighing in relief. Clara Kent closed her restaurant for renovations, though everyone knew it was grief and scandal that had shuttered her doors. And Vaughan, she stayed silent. She didn't beg, didn't bargain, didn't confess beyond Wolfe's walls. She walked into custody with her chin high, and rumor had it she carried herself the same way in the Tombs. Maybe she thought dignity would soften the bars. Maybe she just knew she'd already played her last card. On the 3rd evening after, I found Wolfe in the office, feet planted square on the footstool, beer within easy reach. The lamplight burnished the bookshelves and cast deep shadows across his face, making him look less like a man and more like a monument. I leaned on the globe, arms folded. "You know," I said, "for someone who insists he hates interruptions, you came alive during this one. You haven't looked that engaged since the case with the forged manuscripts." His eyelids lowered in that infuriating way he had when preparing to lecture. "Archie, interruptions are intolerable. But if they must occur, one may as well convert nuisance into clarity. Merridin was detestable, but his death served a function. It exposed rot festering beneath silk and silver." "Meaning Vaughan," I said. "Meaning all of them," he corrected. Stroud's vanity, Ashford's avarice, Kent's despair, Harper's spite. Each revealed themselves, their appetites, their limits. Vaughan merely went further, trespassing into murder. I sank into the red chair across from him. "So what's the moral this time, boss? Don't trust critics. Don't hire waiters with gambling debts. Or maybe just don't invite Camilla Vaughan to dinner." His lips pressed together, not amused. "The moral, Archie, is that appetite unchecked is the root of all corruption. Merridin consumed reputations. Vaughan consumed Merridin, and the city will continue to breed such gluttony until men learn restraint. That'll be the day," I muttered. "Indeed," he said, closing his eyes. "Thus I remain vigilant." That was Wolfe in full, pompous, profound, and absolutely correct. He didn't fight battles with fists or pistols, but with words, logic, and the absolute certainty that lies cannot survive his scrutiny. And he didn't need me to tell him that, though I sometimes did anyway. Later, Fritz brought in a plate of pastries, delicate, flaky things that melted the second they hit your tongue. Wolfe ate in silence, and I let the calm settle. The office no longer carried the charge of conflict, only the hum of order restored. But as I leaned back, watching him, I couldn't help thinking of Vaughan's last words before she'd been taken away. Merridin was a monster. He ruined lives. I stopped him. She had said it with such conviction that for a moment you could almost believe her act had been something more than selfish desperation. "Almost, boss," I said, breaking the quiet. "Do you ever wonder if they convinced themselves that maybe Vaughan really thought she was doing something noble?" He swallowed, then set his fork down with precision. "Conviction is the common refuge of the guilty. They clothe their folly in noble garments to ease their conscience. It does not alter the act. She poisoned, he died. That is the sum." "Cold," I said. "Correct," he replied. I didn't argue. The truth was, Wolfe's clarity was the reason we were never fooled for long. Vaughan's calm, Stroud's panic, Ashford's bluster, they'd all crumbled under his logic. That was his weapon, and it never missed. The evening drifted on. Wolfe turned to a book of Montaigne essays. Fritz hummed faintly from the kitchen, and I scribbled a few notes in my pad, not for Wolfe, but for myself. Cases like this left a residue, and sometimes it helped to write it out, to see the lines of the pattern as clearly as Wolfe always did. When I closed the pad, Wolfe looked up. "Archie, yeah?" He regarded me for a long moment. "Guard the sanctity of this house, not just for me, but for yourself. It is rare, this constancy. Do not squander it." I wasn't used to him sounding almost sentimental, so I covered it with a grin. "Don't worry. I'm not about to start serving poisoned ragout to dinner guests." He harumphed and returned to his book, which in Wolfe's language meant the conversation was over. I rose, stretched and glanced around the office, the familiar red chairs, the polished globe, the shelves heavy with knowledge, the desk that had seen 100 confrontations and 100 revelations. It was whole again, untouched by poison, untouched by lies. At least until the next fool walked in, thinking they could outwit the immovable man in the chair. As I headed for the door, I tossed one last remark over my shoulder. "Well, boss, the way I see it, the secret ingredient wasn't arsenic at all. It was you. Without you, they'd still be chewing each other to pieces." His eyes flicked up, glinted once, then closed again. "Pui," he muttered. And that was that. Judgment rendered, balance restored, and dinner consumed. The brownstone had survived another incursion, and Nero Wolfe sat unshaken at its heart. Outside, the city clattered on with its endless hungers, but here, at least, truth had been served. The city had already moved on. That's how it goes in New York. Yesterday's scandal gets wrapped in today's fish. Vaughan's arrest made the rounds. Merredin's obituary appeared with more tact than he'd shown in life, and the restaurant gossip circled like pigeons in Union Square. But inside the brownstone, the echoes lingered. You can't host betrayal under your roof without hearing the floorboards creak a little louder for a while. Wolfe, of course, behaved as if nothing had ever disturbed his domain. By the following week, the orchids had his attention, and Fritz had filled the larder with delicacies that seemed chosen less for variety than for defiance. Dinner that night was duck with an orange glaze that could have won a truce between warring nations. Afterward, Wolfe sat back in his chair, glass in hand, eyes half closed. "Archie," he said, "it is remarkable how swiftly men forget disruption when appetite is sated. Order appears eternal when the belly is full." "Maybe," I said, leaning on the desk. "But Fritz won't be forgetting any time soon." "Neither will I," his eyes opened, steady and precise. "You will not forget because you should not. This house is sanctuary. Its violation is intolerable. Yet it will be violated again. That is the nature of folly. It seeks constancy to exploit it." I smirked. "So we just keep patching the roof every time the rain comes?" "Not patching," he corrected. "Preserving. This brownstone is not merely walls and mortar. It is principle, and principles must be defended with vigilance, not with resignation." There it was, the Wolfe philosophy in a nutshell, immovable, demanding, and inconveniently true. He wasn't just guarding the orchids upstairs or the meals Fritz perfected. He was guarding the one place where truth had to stand, even when the city outside was drowning in lies. I nodded, because there wasn't much else to say. He lifted his glass, drained it, and closed his eyes again. Conversation over. I turned off the lamp, letting the shadows reclaim the room, and paused at the door. The brownstone was whole again, but it wouldn't stay that way forever. Someone would knock sooner or later, bringing another secret, another appetite, another betrayal. And Wolfe would be here waiting, grumbling about interruptions but dismantling the lies piece by piece. As for me, I'd be on the streets when he needed me, running down trails, dodging bullets, or just collecting the scraps of truth for him to assemble. That's the deal. He thinks I move. And together we keep the walls from caving in. So the case closed the way they always do. Not with fireworks or headlines, but with order restored in one stubborn corner of Manhattan. Wolfe got his piece, Fritz got his kitchen back, and I got the satisfaction of watching another lie go down hard. And if you ask me, that's the real secret ingredient.